Hello and welcome. I am Lian Van and this is Rappler Talk. The Philippines passed its anti-terrorism law at the height of the pandemic in 2020. At the same time, our neighbors Hong Kong also passed its similar national security law also at the height of the pandemic. It's a China-backed law that is widely criticized for criminalizing dissent. Two of the most feared provisions are the ones on subversion and foreign collusion. One of those on trial is Hong Kong's prominent pro-democracy figure, Jimmy Lai, the owner of the independent Apple Daily. We're here in London to talk to his son Sebastian and his lawyer Keelan Gallagher Casey to talk about the case of Jimmy Lai and what's been happening since. Sebastian, you're here in London. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me on your platform. So I'm here to campaign for my father's release, to have the UK government call out what is happening to him, the injustice that is, the injustice of the charges that is leveled against him, and to pressure them to ask for my father, who's a British citizen, to release as well.
Yeah, because Jimmy, your father has been in jail continuously for a period of 2 years, and it's not even under the national security law. He was arrested for another.
Yep, so since the end of 2020, he was arrested and then denied bail. Since then, he's been charged with 4 counts of unauthorized assembly. So what does that signify? One of the counts for which he got 13 months for was for lighting a candle and singing a prayer at the Tiananmen Square vigil. Yeah. It was a 15-minute affair, something that he's done for the last 30 odd years since the Tiananmen Square massacre, and for that he got 13 months.
Right, and then Apple Daily was shut down also.
Yeah, and actually that was a very, I think that's a very striking image to many people from Hong Kong. You'd imagine a newsroom, a whole building of people typing away their computers, and hundreds of policemen raiding the building, taking laptops, taking hard drives, and stopping everyone from working, but also basic barefaced intimidating them into not doing their job.
Keelan, let's go to you for a bit. The latest development is a report from the All-Party Parliamentary Group of the UK. What is it and what did the report say?
Of course. So the All-Party Parliamentary Group is a group of parliamentarians in the UK who have a particular interest in Hong Kong. They've got expertise in it. And we're pleased to say that on Monday of this week, they published a report about media freedom in Hong Kong, the case of Jimmy Lai and Apple Daily. And they've identified precisely what you've just heard about from Sebastian, that this is a gentleman who's 75, a British national, who has spent decades speaking truth to power and is now in prison for it. He's in prison for his journalism, he's in prison for his writing, and he's in prison for his peaceful pro-democracy campaigning. He's trod on some dangerous toes, some powerful toes over the last few years, and that's why he's been targeted. And you asked Sebastian about the range of different legal threats that he's faced. This is something very familiar to a Philippines audience, because what we've seen here is lawfare. He's essentially facing lawfare, multiple different ways in which the law has been weaponized to target him and to try to silence him. Something I see with my client Maria Ressa in the Philippines. It's something that we saw, for example, with Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta. We're increasingly seeing regimes who want to silence journalists using all sorts of different laws to try to do that. And Jimmy Lai is a victim of that.
Can you tell us what is the probably legal or even political significance of the APPG report?
Of course. So the APPG report is very important because it lays bare just how egregious what's happened to Jimmy Lai is, and it also makes clear that his case is emblematic of a shrinking civil society space in Hong Kong. It describes how media freedom in Hong Kong has vanished in a very short space of time, and it also makes a series of recommendations about what more the UK government should be doing, both to secure the freedom of Jimmy Lai and to support Sebastian and his family, but also to try to change that trajectory that we're seeing in Hong Kong, where a place which was a beacon in the region for such a long time of freedom and democracy has in a very short space of time reverted to authoritarian rule. So it's a hugely important report. It does also importantly highlight the many risks to businesses operating in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong at the moment is attempting to send a message out to the world that it's open for business. It's a safe place for people to operate. What we've seen with Jimmy Lai's case is essentially state-sponsored theft of a media company. So we've seen his business targeted, hugely successful media company targeted, and very importantly, a very significant independent Chinese language media outlet silenced. And the printing presses have stopped. Apple Daily's been shut down essentially since 2021. And before Jimmy Lai has even had his trial on the national security law charges, the newspaper has stopped.
Yeah.
And this is hugely significant for the Philippines as well,
Yeah.
for everyone worldwide who cares about freedom and the entitlement of people to speak truth to power.
The APPG report was a parliamentary move. I understand that the Foreign Secretary has also spoken about your father before the UN Human Rights Council. That's an executive move. Are these moves enough for the both of you? You think both of you can answer? Is this the action that you want to see from the UK government?
So the short answer is no, it's not enough. First of all, the UK government for 2 years had total radio silence on this case. So a former Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, did condemn Jimmy Lai's arrest in December 2020. But from December 2020 to December 2022, the UK government was silent. Now, we don't know if that was a deliberate decision because of the UK government wanting closer trading relationship with China and Hong Kong, or if it was simply a sign of the UK government being in disarray. You'll recall, Leanne, that we had multiple different prime ministers and foreign secretaries during that time. So it's unclear whether it was cock-up or conspiracy, if I can put it that way. But the end result was 2 years of not speaking out about this case and Jimmy Lai languishing in prison during that time, his government not speaking out for him. I'm pleased to say we've seen some change in that since December. It's only baby steps, it's nowhere near enough. We finally have seen Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan commenting on the case in December on our personal Twitter account. We then saw the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly expressly referring to Jimmy Lai's case at the UN Human Rights Council in February, and the UK making reference to it at the UN Human Rights Council in March. That's all positive, but nowhere near enough. This week, James Cleverly gave a speech about the UK's engagement with China, and notably absent was this issue. This should be a political priority for the UK. And I know Sebastian has specific things he'd like the UK to do.
Yeah, Sebastian, how does that, what does it mean to you, like the recent developments? Is that enough for you?
So it's actually pretty disheartening because we're both, so my family were all British. The fact that the UK, as I mentioned before, hasn't called for his release, which is where you assume the bare minimum that a government would do for a wrongly imprisoned citizen. It really is shocking because without calling for his release and without condemning what is happening to him and to many political prisoners in Hong Kong, you're letting Hong Kong use you as a moral laundromat. Hong Kong turns around and says, look, the UK isn't speaking out, which makes what we're doing here okay. And I mean, anybody you don't even need to have studied law to know that lighting a candle, for example, shouldn't carry a 13-month sentence.
And I should say, Leanne, just adding to that, the chief prosecutor in Hong Kong and the minister recently were praising the fact that under the national security law, they have a 100% conviction record.
Right.
Now, this is a law that's been widely condemned by the United Nations, by the European Union, by the US government, by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and so on. And that law is now being used to silence many people, not just Jimmy Lai, but others, anyone else who dares to speak out. Even just this week, we've seen a student who's from Hong Kong but was studying in Japan, returning to Hong Kong during a holiday and being arrested for material she posted on her social media whilst in Japan. So this is Hong Kong trying to use the long arm of the state to silence its critics, not only within Hong Kong itself, but wherever in the world they may be. And that's an extremely worrying development and something which people need to stand up to.
Yeah, which leads me to my next question, because I read that over 250 people have been arrested under the national security law, and it has a provision for colluding with foreign agents, which could be a little bit of overreach. And you are in the UK campaigning for his release. Are you under any kind of cloud of fear that you may be also targeted by the NSL?
So they've already spoken out about me, as in the Hong Kong government has already spoken out about me campaigning for my father's release. And as a result, I haven't seen him since he's
Right.
been arrested because I can't go back to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, the law is so broadly worded that I mean, it is definitely a huge issue for everybody. Obviously in Hong Kong, but abroad as well. And I mean, I think Keenan would tell you they've also had threats leveled against them.
Yeah.
It's absolutely ridiculous that the UK government doesn't speak about,
Right.
like a citizen in their own country getting threatened by a foreign government.
So, Leanne, you're speaking here to one very brave man who is certainly his father's son and who's decided also, like Jimmy Lai did, that he's going to speak truth to power despite the risks to him. And as a result of that, he has been unable to return to Hong Kong, as you've heard, since December 2020 when his father was arrested. And just to put this into stark relief, Jimmy Lai, under the national security law, is charged with what are called grave crimes, with a minimum sentence of 10 years, maximum sentence of life. And he's already 75. This is an unfair law that has been widely condemned internationally and under which there's a 100% conviction record. So we can all see what way this is going. And unless the international community speaks out, I'm afraid we are going to see Sebastian's father, a British national, die in prison. And die in prison for his journalism, for his writing, and for his peaceful advocation of pro-democracy and pro-human rights principles. It's completely unacceptable. And he's a man who chose to stay put in Hong Kong when he could easily have plied his trade elsewhere, moved to the UK, moved to the US. But he chose to stand up and be counted. And now it's time the world stands up and is counted for him.
Yeah, let me just go a little bit legalistic for a while, because you've also brought this to the attention of the UN Group on Arbitrary Detention.
That's right.
It's been raised to the Human Rights Council. What other international mechanisms are you looking at? And maybe you could speak to the probably limitations of taking it to an international court.
Of course. So first of all, within the UN special procedures, we have filed an urgent appeal with the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and with a number of the special rapporteurs. So the Special Rapporteur on Peaceful Assembly, because of course Jimmy Lai has already served sentences, disgraceful sentences and disproportionate sentences for entirely peaceful pro-democracy activities. We've also filed a complaint with the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, very importantly, and with the Special Rapporteur on counter-terrorism, because the national security law is a distortion of principles about counter-terrorism and trying to paint any form of dissent as terrorism, as you essentially said in your opening remarks. So we're waiting to hear the outcome about that, and that has already been filed. We're waiting to hear. You're quite right that there are limitations on how Hong Kong and China can be held to account internationally, because when you have a regime which is not rule of law compliant, it's very important that you hold them to account. But if they've constructed themselves in such a way that it's hard to take them to an international tribunal, how do you do that? And that's why it's of vital importance that countries that care about freedom use the power that they have in their bilateral relations to hold Hong Kong to account. And we're very pleased to see a very strong, robust response so far from the European Union External Action Service and from the US government. They've spoken out very strongly about this emblematic case and how damaging it is for the people of Hong Kong. And it's high time that the UK government strengthened its resolve, moved on from the baby steps it's taken so far, and was far more robust fighting for its citizen.
Right. Sebastian, you already spoke earlier about the image of like Apple Daily staff being taken out of the office. Could you speak more of, from your perspective, what is now the state of free speech in Hong Kong?
So after Apple Daily got closed down, Stan News got closed down as well. And there really is this blanket of fear that's across the media landscape in Hong Kong. It seems that Chinese media in the Chinese language, are getting clamped down on. And very simple examples is what happened to, again, my father, his colleagues, but also to some of the editors of Stan News. A quite a striking story was that when my father and his colleagues got arrested, a lot of our journalists stayed up till 6 a.m. every single day for 2 weeks, because 6 a.m. is when they knock on your door to tell you that you're also coming to the police station. So you have all these very powerful images, created by the Hong Kong government,
Right.
and those serve as warning to Chinese media. Now, Western media seems to have a bit more leeway, but a lot of what's happening in the courts and just in society in general is in Chinese.
Yeah.
So by essentially cutting off Chinese media, the primary source, a lot of the primary source has disappeared.
Keelan, could you speak more about the state of, I guess, lawfare and prosecution of journalists in the Asian region, just to bring it closer to the Asian and Filipino audiences?
Of course, and if I could start just by saying that Amnesty International described the closure of Apple Daily in 2021 as the blackest day for Hong Kong's democracy. And that's quite a good description. This is so stark, seeing a media outlet shut down in that way. And this is something not unfamiliar to a Philippines audience, given, and of course to you, Leanne, given the threats not only to Maria Ressa, my client, but also to Rappler as a news organisation. And we've seen in the region a trend also of the misuse of sedition laws.
Right.
And this is something which is a colonial era hangover from the UK, from its days of British Empire, where many countries in the region have these old-fashioned sedition laws. And we're now seeing those weaponized against journalists too. And in Jimmy Lai's case, as well as being prosecuted under the national security law, he's also being prosecuted for sedition.
Right.
And that's something which is very familiar in the region. And it's why I very much support the call by many academics and experts in the space for those sedition laws to be repealed and to see an end to the misuse of sedition and national security laws targeting journalists. I did mention lawfare, and you asked me about that. One trend I'm increasingly seeing is the misuse of laws which are not targeted ostensibly at journalism at all. So attempts to slur journalists and suggest they're untrustworthy in some way. So, for example, charging journalists, rather than using defamation laws or even national security laws, using things like fraud laws or regulatory laws, or claiming that journalists are corrupt. And that's something that we've seen in Jimmy Lai's case, attempts to paint him as an untrustworthy figure. We also see it with the way in which Maria Ressa has been targeted in the Philippines, Mir Shakil or Rahman in Pakistan. And that's a very worrying trend. And the Committee to Protect Journalists has just published a report on lawfare and the weaponization of laws just very recently in the last week. And they've highlighted this as a trend. So the misuse of laws which are designed to undermine the journalist as a person and to suggest to the wider public, this is someone you can't trust. That's a very worrying trend. Happens a lot in the region, but also happens increasingly internationally. And it's something that we must address.
Maria calls it, in her last speech, it's like the last 2 minutes of democracy. Do you agree to that characterization? And also, Sebastian, do you agree to that characterization that the space is shrinking quicker than we can recognize?
Yeah. I mean, Hong Kong's a perfect example.
Yeah.
I mean, in Hong Kong, you could see a place that used to be a beacon of all these freedoms in Asia, and within what is essentially 5 years, it's gone to a place where everybody's scared of speaking out.
Yeah.
There's no objective. There's no free Chinese media, Chinese language media, anymore. And so it really seems that the less you call these autocrats out on what they're doing to free media, the more they are emboldened by it. And the more they're emboldened by it, the less free media there is in that country. So it's this vicious cycle that ends with the collapse of freedom of speech.
Yeah. Keelan, Doughty Chambers has handled many human rights cases. How is Hong Kong contextually different, historically different, politically different?
So it's interesting you ask that, because some of the cases that I do involve journalists or human rights defenders being imprisoned in states which are widely recognized as being autocratic.
Yeah.
So, for example, people being imprisoned in Egypt, or being imprisoned in Iran, or being imprisoned in Saudi Arabia. And the tactics that you need to use in those kinds of cases are quite different to the tactics you might use, for example, when you're dealing with threat to media freedom in a European Union country.
Right.
And I'm afraid what we're seeing in Hong Kong is the worst kind of example And it's much more in the Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt bracket than in anything else. And I'll give you one example of that. We mentioned earlier the long arm of the Chinese state and the long arm of the Hong Kong state trying to target people wherever they may be. As a result of even acting in this case, myself and my colleagues have been threatened in a very serious way, receive rape threats, death threats, threats of dismemberment, receive very thinly veiled threats in state media, so Chinese state media, essentially calling us enemies of the people, simply for doing our jobs, for being international human rights lawyers. And Sebastian, who's speaking out about his father and calling for his father's release, has seen a formal statement issued by the Hong Kong authorities accusing him of committing a crime for so doing. And that's a disgrace. And it really is a total subversion of the principles which for so long Hong Kong held dear, and the principles which are so dear to his father's heart. And that's an extreme example. And in all the cases I've done, I've never been targeted in this extreme and consistent a way as I am on this particular case. And that is a blot on Hong Kong's copybook. The way in which they're treating us and they're treating Sebastian really shows precisely why the APPG report's criticisms this week were correct. And the APPG itself, so the all-party parliamentary group itself, its report was published on Monday, formal statement from the Hong Kong authorities on Tuesday to say we think this report is slanderous. So again, thinly veiled threats against parliamentarians. Got to remember, China has already sanctioned parliamentarians for speaking out on human rights issues. It sanctioned people from the European Parliament, members of the European Parliament, and members of Parliament in the UK for commenting on the Uyghur people and human rights violations by China. So this is a regime which is quite content to try to silence its critics and use whatever powers it has at its disposal, wherever they may be. And it's high time we stood up to it.
Right. Sebastian, the last question is for you. What do you want to happen from here point on, and how quickly do you want these to happen?
Well, I want my father to be released as soon as possible. I haven't seen him in 2 years, 2.5 years almost. Obviously, I'll deeply miss him. He decided to stand up for this truth, that freedom of speech, rule of law, is important to everyone. And for that, at an age where most people would retire and enjoy the fruits of labor, he is sitting in a jail in Hong Kong. So I ask that anybody listening to this can bring attention to the case and call for his release.
Right, Keelan, you wanted to say something?
So I'd echo what Sebastian has said. I think what all of us want to see is this remarkable, brilliant man released from prison, reunited with his family. We all want to see that. And there's a part that everyone can play in doing that. Sebastian is leading the Free Jimmy Lai campaign. Those of you who are on social media can see that, can follow it, can follow Support Jimmy Lai and look at the hashtag Free Jimmy Lai and spread the word. And wherever anyone is watching this piece, we ask them to write to their own government, to ask their own government to raise this as a matter of priority with the Hong Kong authorities. We want to make sure that the name Jimmy Lai is on as many foreign leaders' lips as possible so that Hong Kong understands precisely what the ramifications are if they continue to treat this man in this way and if they continue to treat media freedom and human rights in Hong Kong in this way.
Thank you so much for your time. That was Sebastian Lai, the son of Jimmy Lai, and Keelan Gallagher Casey, lawyer of Jimmy Lai. Thank you for watching Rappler Talk.